There we go. So, hello to everyone who's joining here. I'm going to host the first revision session of the day, and I'm going to talk about general exam preparation tips, especially for psychology. So I'll be first go through the assessment components of the exam, and then talk about SAQ, ERQ, general critical thinking tips, and a bunch of bonus stuff that can hopefully help you with preparing your exams. So I'm gonna go through this really quick because I'm pretty sure you guys already know about this. So for this year, due to the coronavirus, SL only needs to take paper 1, while HL needs to take paper 1 and paper 2, where in paper 2 you only answer 1 ERQ. And as you may already know, paper 1 has 3 SAQs and 1 ERQs. Keep in mind that the weighting of these has changed significantly if you're taking the exams. As you can see for SL, it's 65% of your grade. So make sure that you're doing, it's only one paper, so make sure you're doing really well. Same goes with HL, especially on paper 1. It's now 50% of your final grades if you're doing your exams. Okay, so what does paper 1 and paper 2 consist of? It consists of section A and section B. Section A being that you have to answer all 3 SAQs. Section B, where you have to answer only 1 out of the 3 ERQs. Keep in mind that each of these questions will be different approaches. And for HL, for one of the SAQs, it'll be on HL extension. And then for paper 2, you're going to have all the option questions. And for each option, you're going to have 3 questions. And in these questions, they will definitely have different topics. So if you're studying for HL, you need to make sure that you're studying one option and specifically on one topic, unless if you want to study 2 topics, just in case if you get a bad question. Okay, so before we go into SAQs, I'm going to clarify some terminologies here, which I think gets really confusing sometimes if you're not sure what they refer to. Especially, this is IB specific terminology, by the way, in psychology. So when we refer to research or evidence used to support responses, we call that study. Don't call that a case study, because a case study refers to a whole different type of research method. It's basically a case study is where you want to investigate a new phenomenon or a specific individual that's rare. In the case of H.R. Milner, you don't really experience people who gets removed, you don't experience people whose brain parts gets removed like that, and you don't get to observe people like that because that's not really ethical to do. Or if you want to investigate a certain phenomenon that's not really investigated in psychology yet because there's not enough research, you do case studies. So don't refer to studies as case studies. And then we also have topic, content, and additional terms. So as you can see there, topics are the ones such as brain and behavior, emotion, cognition, digital technology, etiology for normal psychology. It's the stuff underneath the hierarchy of approaches. And then underneath the hierarchy of topics, we have content, which is the theories or models we learn in each topic, like reconstructive memory, prevalence rates, blah, blah, blah. Pretty sure it's clear right there. And after the M20 exams, we also have additional terms, which is the new words that appeared starting from M20. And it's only asked in SAQ level. Okay, so now we're going on to SAQs, short answer questions. So in order for you to want to do well in SAQs, you need to make sure to know what are the type of questions that is going to come out in SAQ. So there are 2 common types of questions that is going to come out, which is, oh my god, I'm so sorry, I didn't double check. Those command terms are wrong. That's supposed to be for ERQs. It's supposed to be outline, explain, and describe. I'm going to change that later. after. So yeah, it's supposed to be outline, explain, and describe one study plus content or additional terms. So if you're not sure what our new additional terms are, you can check out the links that I placed. Wait, did I send the presentation in this chat? Oh God, it's... Wait, let me send the presentation in the chat so you guys can access it easily. There you go. And let me pin it so it's easy, like, for you guys to keep in track with it. All right. So next we have outline, describe, or explain the general learning outcomes, the general LOs, plus topic. So the general learning outcomes, as you may know, is research methods and ethical considerations. If you have no idea what I just said, here are some examples to help you like understand it better. So for this part, I really don't know like how the IB would exactly word it, because as you may know, the syllabus is kind of new, and like from the several resources that I found, there's like different types of wording styles. But the main point is it follows the possible SAQ question structure. So as you can see, like for some of them, they're very long and very complicated. But if you really like break it down, it's just it has the same point. Like outline cultural groups using one study in cultural origins of behavior and cognition. That sounds like very long, but it's actually just asking you to talk about cultural groups. So like if you encounter like a new unfamiliar wording, question wording in the psychology exam or mocks in general, make sure to take your time to break the questions down into the command terms, the content or topic, and you can, from there on, you can identify what they're like, the main points of what they're asking you to do. So if you guys are in exams and you see like whack wording, don't feel intimidated. It's okay. Oh, and another thing to note is that apparently in the specimen paper, I don't know like if every one of you is aware of this, but I feel like not a lot of people are aware of this, is that they can ask one strength and one limitation of a research method, like in my presentation here. Because it's in the specimen paper and they don't really specify if it's removed or not in the M20. So it's probably going to be included, or a possible question like that is going to happen. Okay, so something that people often get confused with all these terms is that they get confused with like outline, describe, and explain. They're actually not that different. Like if you're going to study, if you're going to plan to like memorize the stuff, like the theories, the studies, etc., they're not going to matter. But when you're writing your response, you sort of have to like tweak it a bit to directly answer the question. So for this advice, I'd give you like to not worry too much about it. Especially when you're studying, just make sure like it makes sense when you're answering the question in the exam. You know, when you're writing the SAQ. That's all that matters. Because the reason why I said that, even though there are like different definitions, like for example, when we say outline, it's about giving account or summary, right? When we say describe, it's about giving detailed account. So it's like we have to do more stuff. Instead of giving a summary, we have to talk more about what they're asking. And then same goes with explain. You have to talk a lot more than describe and outline. However, the thing with SAQs is that it's marked on the same mark band. So they're going to pay attention about your focus on the question, knowledge understanding, use of research to support answer, the research described, and how it explicitly linked to the question, which is clarity and organization. So really, the differences between these command terms is not, content-wise, it doesn't matter. Yeah. So, a reminder on how to answer SAQ structure. In order to have a good response for SAQ structure, it's important for you guys to have an introduction, a study, and a conclusion. In the introduction, you have to explain what they're asking for. You have to explain the topic, you have to define it and explain it, and link that to a behavior. So I'll have an example later for you guys to demonstrate how to do that effectively. And next up, we have supporting studies, which is a study about the topic that investigates a certain behavior. So for an SAQ, it's important for you to explain the study as detailed as possible, but not to perfect precision kind of detail. It's okay. You don't have to literally. You don't have to do that. Just make sure it's detailed enough for people to clearly understand what's going on in the experiment. And then after that, we have conclusion, where you specifically link the behavior in the study back to the topic to answer the question. Okay, so an example I have here is explain the role of one hormone in human behavior. So in here, in my outline, I define what is a hormone, which is a biochemical messenger, and I explain further about the mechanisms of hormones. So how hormones regulate the body's long-term functions from the endocrine to the bloodstream, and that is hard to control voluntarily, and that how it works is that it indirectly creates behaviors by activating or suppressing genes. And then since I chose Crosswell et al. 2005 as my study, I have to briefly explain about what oxytocin is, because the study talks about oxytocin and breaches of trust. So that's how I link a hormone to a behavior, that oxytocin is linked to trusting behavior. And then in the conclusion, you should talk about how oxytocin increases people's trusting behavior in regards to the study. So in the study, they specifically talked about how when you have interpersonal relations with each other and you have increased oxytocin, you will have people's trusting behavior increases. So in that, after concluding about that, you still have to explain how it answers the SAQ. That's why you have to make sure to link back. Okay. Do you guys have any questions? Okay, let me scroll through the chat because there's a lot. Oh, there's no questions. Okay. So that means I can proceed. Jesus, it's only 15 minutes. I thought this was going to take longer. Okay, next we have essay response questions, or ERQs. This time I didn't get it wrong. Okay, so for ERQ questions, it's kind of similar to SAQs, but instead of so in SAQs, they usually only do one something, one study, one research method, one ethical consideration. For ERQs, it's always going to be one or more. ERQs are always going to give you the freedom to like put in however much hormones or however much studies you want. But that's okay, so that's not really like the point. So I'll explain that later. So basically, one of the possible structures is to contrast or discuss or to evaluate to what extent, plus one or more study or maybe not, depending on how the question is asked, plus the content or topic, and then the command terms, plus the general LOs, plus the topic. For this one, I don't think they will ask one strength and one limitation of research methods, because that doesn't make sense. Like, they're definitely going to say like one or more research methods. It would be like a lot too convoluted to like say one or more strength and one or more limitation of research methods. Like, because those are going to be included anyway in the ERQs later when you evaluate your studies or whatever that is relevant. And then finally, for HL, you have the HL content plus topic. Oh, and just to clarify, like for the first type, they can also ask like in that format for HL contents or topics. So the last format is like specifically for HL content. And for options, they also ask similarly for like the type 1 and type 2. Because the last HL content is supposed to be specifically for HL content for core approaches, not for not because of like the coronavirus adjustments that occurred. So as you can see, like the structure is kind of similar to the SAQs, but this time asked like in using different command terms and a bit of different structuring. Like for type 3. So if you can see with like the questions involving to what extent or contrast, it might sound a bit intimidating because like look at the stark differences between discuss, to what extent, and contrast. If I don't highlight them, it would look very intimidating. Like even I would be a little bit intimidated. But the point is, there's like main keywords you have to look out for, and that's going to always be relevant to what you're studying, if you're studying, that is. And you'll be okay. And for command terms for ERQ, it's also pretty similar to the SAQs. Like content-wise, it's not gonna matter that much, unless if you're doing like contrast for something, contrast two models of memory. That's in that case, you're going to have to show and differentiate between multi-store model and working memory model. But still, it's not going to be very different from what you've learned, other than like making sure that you have to word it out in a way that it shows that you're contrasting between the two. Because you're going to still mention the similarity. You're still going to mention the differences between them, and obviously you're going to explain each of their characteristics and why they're different. So not much of a difference. And same with to what extent. For to what extent, you're basically pointing out like, oh, it's applicable for this, but it's not applicable for that. It's similar to evaluate and discuss. Oh, also, the reason why I mentioned contrast and to what extent is because I think it's easier to deal with evaluate and discuss questions because they sound similar. But for contrast and to what extent, it's not like, not a lot of people get exposed to those kind of questions pretty often. So yeah, so if you do like encounter those kind of questions, just note that it's similar, you just need to frame it, you know, when you're actually finally discussing about it. Okay, so now on the ERQ marking rubric. There's focus on the question, knowledge and understanding, use of researches for answer, critical thinking, and clarity and organization. So in order to get the focus on the question mark, make sure you have to identify and explain what the ERQ is asking, which is something that can be you can easily do if you like identified like what I did before. So just like make a mark or something on like the topics or the contents that's being asked and the command terms, so you can like always refer back and make sure that is what you're doing, and that's what you need to do, what you need to answer. For knowledge and understanding, it's about the use of correct psychology terminology and whether what you're talking about is relevant to answering the ERQ. So you have to make sure like what you're explaining is linked to the is answering the ERQ. You don't pull out evaluations about your studies and be like, oh yeah, so this study has strength this, strength that, limitation this, limitation that. Therefore, the study, let's just say if the study supports the theory, but then there's limitation this, limitation that. And then in the conclusion, you just say, oh yeah, so the study supports the theory because it does support the theory. Like that's not, that makes the limitations seem irrelevant. You have to also kind of like take account of how the limitation helps us, how the limitation affects our understanding about the topic. So like when you, I'm probably going to go in depth about that later, but if you have an evaluation, you have to like, you don't just put it out there because you want to evaluate the study, but you have to put it out there in order to talk about the topic that you're discussing or the content that you're discussing. Use of research to support answer. So for use of research, it's pretty obvious. Just don't use irrelevant studies. That's the easiest way for you like to avoid getting a bad grade from it. Whether you get like full marks for that or not depends on how you explain it. So technically, if you like use the correct research, you're already like pretty safe. Next, we have critical thinking, the stuff that we are always struggling with. For this part, I'm gonna go in depth a bit later, but there's going to be another ERQ session and another critical thinking session, so I'm not going to like go too in depth with it. And then clarity and organization. Clarity isn't just about following the structure and making sure that the structure is correct. It's also about how you like explain things. If you make your explanations look very complicated and the examiner needs to like read twice to make sure to figure out what you're talking about, that means that your essay lacks clarity and organization. So keep that in mind. Okay. ERQs are like extensions of SAQs. It has like, you're going to have to explain the theory that's being asked, and then you have to put in a supporting argument, which is like about how the topic affects behavior. And there's usually like, depending on the topic, there's a lot of different arguments that you can take. You don't have to cover everything. The point is to maybe take at least like two different arguments, and then talk about it critically. That's what IB wants. They don't expect you to cover everything. So usually the recommended structure that people will definitely give to you is to do 2 studies and evaluate them. The reason why they do that is because that allows you to, that gives you the opportunity for you to like have one perspective and then one supporting study and then one evaluation about that perspective and about how we understand the topic. And then after that we have the second perspective. So like it helps develop your critical thinking. However, when we begin writing ERQs, or when we're not used to writing ERQs, we tend to think of it like, oh, intro, study, evaluation, conclusion. If you follow that correctly and evaluate the studies properly, that will give you around 5 or 6. If you don't mess up anything else, like if you memorize the studies and if you memorize the theories and etc. etc. If you follow that structure, I can guarantee that you'll get a 5 or 6. But for a 7, you need to make sure that the study is actually used to support like an argument. Because that will help show that you truly understand the topic that's being asked by demonstrating that you know there's like 2 different types of positions to take, or 2 different perspectives you can take on the topic that's being asked. Okay, so like my random tips, this structure can actually be a lot more flexible than you think. You don't have to follow the structure like you don't have to strictly follow the structure, but this is like the recommended structure if you're like beginning to do ERQs. But since we're doing exams, this structure can be a lot more flexible than you think. So you can also do 3 perspectives. Let's just say if we have something like localization. In localization, we have 3 common arguments, right? At least, like following, if we study from the Oxford Psychology book, we know that we have 3 arguments. We have the strict localization, relative localization, and holism. So you can try to expand this structure into 3 different arguments. Or let's just say if you're talking about pheromones, you want to do this kind of structure, and then you want to have an extra structure to evaluate and talk about how pheromones, the study of pheromones is quite inconclusive. You can add an extra paragraph underneath and talk about that to demonstrate your understanding about pheromones. So if you want like some examples for exemplar structures, like how this is just the common trend, not necessarily like the structure that you stick, you can check the exemplar. But if you're not confident with yourself, you can always stick to this structure because this is like the safe structure. Okay. One last thing before we move on is that to make sure to take time to plan your ERQ writings. I think this tip is not going to be relevant for like everyone, but at least for like me, or at least from what I see from most people, it really helps to structure or plan what you want to write, like 5 minutes. Just take 5 minutes and then like scribble this kind of structure before writing, so it can give you a clear direction of what you're going to write next. Yeah, so hopefully that helps you like have a better structure and well basically help you have a better clarity and organization in your ERQ. Okay, now we're going into critical thinking. Before we go into critical thinking, okay. It seems like there's a question here in Discord channel. Okay. Mm-hmm. Hmm. That will also work. Mm-hmm. Okay. That's a good question. So the thing with studies in psychology is that in the even in the syllabus itself, it doesn't specify how many studies you need to use. So you can use as much studies as you want, or you can use 2 studies, or you can just use one very very detailed study. Let's just say you want to go into. Do you guys know Milner at all? Um, like the H.M. Milner. So it was a study about. It was an in-depth case study about a guy who's who got into a surgery and got his hippocampus removed. And the psychologist did a lot of things, a lot of experiments with him, and discovered a lot of things. Um, it.
Just to
Mhm.
interject, Rolla, I don't think you're allowed to actually use that because my psych teacher told me there are a few studies that have rotated out of the IB. I actually scored 3 out of 9 on one SAQ because I used a study that's not
Oh.
part of the thing. Yeah, as someone who did SAQs and ERQs maybe once every 2 weeks during my high school years. Yeah, I've made a lot of mistakes, and there are a few studies that you need to be wary of that you might not be able to use in the exam. Studies like HM or ASH. You can use the ASH paradigm, but you can't actually use the ASH study itself. I don't think so.
Just to
Okay.
add on to that,
Okay.
I was told that studies pre-1950 are not to be used. So
Yeah.
that's what my teachers told me.
But quick question: is that because the IB doesn't let you, or because they are considered not liable?
Okay. Okay. I'll take time to answer each of these one by one. So, um, for the matter with the HM study, that might kind of depend on your teachers. Because for my teacher, he still accepted, he's still okay with using the HM Milner study because it's at least for the citation that we usually use is 1966, and the study that's usually recommended for the IB is 1960s and above. So 19 yeah, 1960s and above. That's what I know. The reason why they suggest 1960s and above is because the studies before that are often not really valid in a way that over time, the psychology, a lot of psychology studies, rigor in experiment conduct or replication wise, is not very good. That's why they prefer you to have studies that are 1960s and above. And also because I guess in a way, IB psychology also wants you to be oh yeah, we're using modern studies, instead of using old studies. So regarding the Asian thing, okay, maybe for some teachers they would say no, but it's still a study that a lot of people are okay with using. So I feel like that's one of the exceptions, like the borderline okay ones, but like anything before that, anything before 1960s, you're not really allowed to use.
Yeah, just
Yeah.
really double check with your teacher too. And
Mm-hmm.
even with like, things like finished gauge, I wasn't allowed to use either.
Oh, for finished gauge, it's definitely not allowed because it was like 1980 something, like a lot way back.
Oh yeah, sure.
Yeah.
I can't remember any time. And honestly, you don't even need to know the date going into the examiners.
Yeah, you don't, but I just memorize them because I like memorizing them.
Okay, right.
Wait, but for
It
the
feels.
thing,
Hmm?
if there's a psychologist that has conducted several studies, and I think it was Loftus, for example, that has conducted several, then it would be important to put the date so the examiner would know which of the studies you reference to.
Okay, yeah, in that
Yeah.
case, yes.
It's
But
not.
the Loftus studies have other psychologists as well. Right, so it's not just Loftus, right? It's Loftus and Palmer and other studies with Loftus.
Yeah.
So I don't think you need to remember the dates if you know the names of all the other psychologists as well.
Mm-hmm.
Alright, to be honest here, like, if the examiner knows what studies you're talking about, then you're fine. Like, if you think the date allows the examiner to know more about what you're talking about, then put it. But the date itself doesn't give you its remark.
Yep.
So, just to confirm, so like studies like Broca's area is not to be used, right?
Yeah, that's not allowed because that's also one of the ones that's pretty old. Like,
Yeah, it's like 19th century.
yeah.
I had another question.
Okay.
For the Loftus studies, I mean, my teacher said you don't have to give the name of the studies. Like, it's fine if you don't give the name or the sample size because they're not that important as long as you know the results and stuff. So, is it necessary to remember all the names of the studies?
You mean like the details of the studies?
Like, for example, who conducted the study and everything.
Oh, it's it's actually not really marked. Like, they don't really test whether you know the author or not. Like, that's not a part of the marking criteria. However,
Okay.
I would still recommend you to remember it because it's not that hard to remember, and it's better to associate the studies with an author unless if you're cramming and you don't remember any. But like,
Right.
yeah, if you're explaining
Okay.
a study in detail, also when I mean in detail, I mean like enough relevant stuff to help you evaluate. It's better to give like the author name. But they won't detract you from the grades. Yeah.
Right. Okay.
Okay, and I'm gonna go back to the question about how many studies. I would recommend 2, just because having like 2 studies explained in detail is already enough to help you like form critical thinking and evaluations. You can add more studies if they're like there are cases where I did also add more studies, like for the evaluations. For example, I talked about in this one, yeah, in this one ERQ, I talked about Lundstrom and Olson, like about how this one study supported the existence of pheromones, this pheromone called AND, androstenediol. And then I added another study in the back saying, oh, however, there's also another study that found that the results are not like I think that was Hare et al. 2000. I forgot the date. This other study used a bigger sample size and did a similar experiment with the initial study, and found that there's no significant results. So in that case, I wouldn't explain the second study in detail. I would just mention like the aim of the study and then how it contradicts with the first study. And I use that to show critical thinking, like about how the study is not easily replicable, results-wise. To demonstrate, like, so there's a lot of inconclusive results going on in pheromones. So you can add more studies if it's relevant, but like in general, like if you want to explain about like the procedure and stuff, because you do need to, for certain experiments, you do need to explain the procedure, the method and stuff, right? To demonstrate your critical thinking later, to use it to roast them or to just show how they're supporting it. And you can definitely add more studies in to talk about how it supports or how it does not support the results. Or let's just say like bringing a meta-analysis to talk about like the general pattern of the study about X. However, you don't have to do that for a good grade. Like if you only have two studies and then you evaluate them using what the general critical thinking on strengths and limitations, and you explain them well, and you link back to the question being asked, that itself can already give you a good grade. So it's not about the studies.
To touch on what Rola said there, I think it's really good also to go into the exam thinking it as a mini meta-analysis. What you're doing is basically a mini version of what you would do if you were to major in psychology in university. Something that I noticed when I write my lab reports that's very different from the IA is that you actually collect mini studies and then you compile them together to do something called a literature review. So what you're doing here with your essays or your ERQs and SAQs, well, more ERQs, is you're actually literally doing a literature review on a specific topic on the behavior. So think of it as that. That's your formula.
Or to like, if you don't know, like if that's too big brain for you, just think of it as like you're trying to make an argument.
A question about that. Since there's some topics that are kind of difficult to argue about, so like neuroplasticity, it's kind of a one-sided argument. I mean, there's not really a lot of evidence against it, I'm guessing. How would you go about arguing for that? Because you wouldn't be able to have this back and forth argument, would you? Because the evidence kind of just speaks for one side of it.
That's a good question. The thing with ERQs is that you don't always have to roast them. Like, you don't always have to like go against, like, you don't always have to go like, oh, so this supports, but then this is against, so, oh no, chaos. You don't always have to do that. You can also take like the approach where you say, okay, so this study supports neuroplasticity. This study, in a different way, let's just say using a different research method, also supports neuroplasticity, but each of these research have their own limitations. Like, so it explains how it can explain how neuroplasticity, like, it can explain how neuroplasticity affects behavior. However, how it's affecting behavior, like how the study demonstrated, is limited. Because for some study, actually for most neuroplasticity studies, they're often reductionist, right? They go like, neuroplasticity causes a behavior. When in fact, behaviors are not always that simple. You always have to consider about how the arguments are, how behavior is holistic, how it's very complicated, and it's not just about brain affecting behavior. There's also environment to consider. So you can explain about, the study supports the phenomenon well. However, just keep in mind that there are these certain issues. Or, for example, there's also usually the issue of small sample size, right? Because neuroplasticity. Yeah, I think neuroplasticity usually tend to have a small sample. Or is that MRI? Like,
We use MRI to find like research about neuroplasticity.
yeah.
So use Maguire et al.
McGuire.
Yeah.
I just got a question. For the alternate argument for neuroplasticity, can't you use localization as an alternate argument?
You're not allowed to use localization as an alternative argument because localization and neuroplasticity are kind of like different phenomenons, but they're not mutually exclusive, but they also have like overlapping parts. So, okay, do you want me to explain why?
Yeah.
Okay, so the thing with localization is that it's talking about how the brain, how a behavior is like. Wait, let me. 1
I
second.
think it's more of
It's,
part of the brain controls the behavior.
yeah, because each brain has their own functions, right? And some of these functions work together to create complex behaviors. So, let's just say for something like strict localization or relative localization, because they're kind of similar, but not exactly yet. They're kind of similar in a way that they talk about how the like specific functions tend to associate with specific brain parts. Well, um, that's just like that's it. Like they're associated with specific brain parts. But with neuroplasticity, it's kind of talking about a whole different argument. It's saying that if you have if you experience a certain environment stimuli, so let's just say you learn juggling, then a certain part of your brain, maybe like the hippocampus, would grow bigger in size because you're stimulating more neurons or you're stimulating like this stuff in your brain to have a bigger capacity to deal with the skill you're learning, juggling. Well, it doesn't stop you from the fact that this juggling skill is still semi-localized in, let's just say, the hippocampus, right? It's still like around the hippocampus. It's just that like with more environmental stimuli, it grows. Um, yeah. So.
So if for a discuss
Mhm.
question, because it being reductionist is not exactly an alternate perspective, it's just a limitation, right?
Yeah.
So in a discuss question, what opposite argument would you give?
For neuroplasticity.
Yeah.
Honestly, I'm not exactly sure. Like, because neuroplasticity
Just to
is
add on to
it's not.
what you're saying before we like move on, I don't think you need a specific counter argument saying that neuroplasticity is 100% wrong. I
Yeah.
think it's much easier a lot of the times to instead provide the two studies that you think support it and say, can we really fully trust these studies to completely support the neuroplasticity? Because neuroplasticity is such a complex thing. Can we really just look at a couple of studies and say it's 100% true? And that's going to be your main argument here. Like, it's so much more complex than that. And what are the weaknesses in these studies that make us question whether we can fully support it?
Yeah.
So, like in the macro evaluation for that, you would address the methodology that we use to study neuroplasticity.
Yeah, like a lot of the times when I talk about neuroplasticity, I usually say something like, neuroplasticity, yes, we have a lot of biological evidence, but at the same time, it's, again, the neuroplasticity occurrence is such a complex thing where so many different behaviors could be impacting it. So especially when you have studies like juggling and neuroplasticity, you can't really always isolate and be sure to isolate this one behavior to neuroplasticity. That is true reductionism. So can we really trust it? There could be so many other things happening and so many other things affecting it.
Yeah.
I don't know, it's just the way I read it.
And think of other phenomenon that actually might affect neuroplasticity, such as either classical conditioning or operant conditioning, where you repeat a lot of behaviors. So there's that bidirectional ambiguity to whether or not neuroplasticity caused the repetition of the behavior, or is it the reinforcement of the behavior or repetition of the behavior that leads to neuroplasticity? So there's a lot of bidirectional ambiguity there. But don't bring in other topics into... If the ERQ question is specifically neuroplasticity, stick to it, and just remember that critical thinking isn't just about seeing it from a different side. It's just how much can you, as I think Moon Flores pointed out, how much can you point out the flaws in which you can trust the studies.
And the strengths of it.
Yeah, as the
Be careful about bidirectional ambiguity, because a lot of neuroplasticity studies use experimentation methods, and a lot of the times the experiments kind of take away the bidirectional ambiguity because you have the correlation
that's
relationship.
more. Yeah, that's more applicable for
So-
cognitive and social
Yeah,
culture.
exactly.
But
Yeah.
Yeah,
So basically, this is just evaluating the studies.
Yeah, but link it to the behavior, the topic, and yeah. Or
if you ever feel like you're going nowhere, just look back to the criteria sheet. Literally, it's just how well are you using the study to make your point. That's it. How detailed can you go? How much sass can you bring to it? Roast it or complement it so that you can support your argument or not support it.
Or for neuroplasticity, instead of thinking of it as counter arguments, you can bring in alternative perspectives. Like in neuroplasticity, we know that there are phenomena such as neural pooling and long-term potentiation, which is like increasing neurons, in short. And neural pruning means like getting rid of the neurons because it's no longer necessary. You can also take an alternative perspective in talking about neuroplasticity. So we can also talk about how if your brain gets injured, like a certain brain part gets, I don't know, something happened to a certain brain part and it gets damaged. There's this phenomenon that neuroplasticity also explains, which is about cortical remapping, where like the functions in like the certain brain gets kind of like redistributed or in a certain way for you to survive. That can also take a different viewpoint about what we know about neuroplasticity and talk about like the phenomenon more interestingly. Does that make
Sorry,
sense?
but I have a question about what just said. So if we can like flip it, and if we were talking about localization, can we use that as a counter argument?
No, we can't, because I just explained you're not allowed to talk about. You're not allowed to bring up localization. Because I don't like, honestly, I didn't study cortical remapping like deeply, but from yeah, sure.
Yeah, bringing in other topics usually work better with cognitive, social, cultural, and some of your options, such as human relationships. Whoever is going to do human relationships with me, I will show you how you want to really interconnect studies together so that you're adding on an extra argument of whether or not we actually form human relationships based on just the theory alone, or is it a universal behavior that you can see around the world? And there is a big study for that, et al. If any of you know. But yeah, if you those kind of seeing from the other point of view is more of a social section approach of psychology. Biological, again, as Rola has said, you can establish cause and effect relationships, so it's less likely that you'll be able to do this from another point of view. And connecting it with other topics, that's tricky.
Yeah. Okay, so to mention about the cortical remapping part, again, like I said, I'm not really I didn't study a lot about that part. However, the general gist that I know about cortical remapping is that, for example, let's say we lost our eyesight. Some part of our brain is damaged, like eyesight-wise. That means you will forever be impaired from being able to see. However, your cortical remapping means that you're going to develop ways to give you another pair of eyes, like not literally, but functionally. You know, like you're going to work around with your sense of touch, your sense of smell, your sense of ears, and basically like master them a lot better compared to your eyesight to cope with that loss. That's why it's not, I don't think it's a good idea to point out, bring out localization for that. Because there's, well, if you want to, you can try to research it more in depth into that. Yeah, so hopefully, to bring up a more accurate vision of how cortical remapping is like in neuroplasticity. Otherwise, I wouldn't recommend you to talk about localization at all. And just like what Jet and don't do psychology said. Yeah, don't bring up localization. Okay. Does anyone have any more questions? I assume that's a no. Okay, let's proceed to the next few slides. So, there are some common acronyms that I found that's really helpful when it comes to critical thinking, which is not just critical thinking, just for ERQ and SAQ as a whole. So we have PEAL, which is point, evidence, explain, and link. These are helpful for writing in general with SAQs, with ERQs. Because in SAQs, you still need to point, you still need to put evidence, which is the study. You still need to explain the topic that you're being asked for, and you still need to link using the evidence. Well, you also need to explain in the end a little bit, just to make sure to clarify what's going on with the study. You can't just leave the examiners hanging like that. And then next, we also have math bears. Basically, these acronyms help you with evaluating your studies. If you're stuck with not knowing what to evaluate, you can try to consider to think about the method, application, triangulation, bias, ethics, areas of uncertainty, reductionism, and sample. So for all of these, not everything is always going to be relevant. Sometimes some things will not be useful in regards to answering your question. You have to keep that in mind. However, if you're the kind of person who struggles with figuring out points for your ERQs, evaluations, this can help. And then next we have TCOP, which is used for evaluating theories. We have testability, empirical evidence, applicability, constructability, unbiased, and predictability. So does anyone want an explanation for some of these terms, just in case? Because I would expect you guys to know what these terms are, since this is the stuff that you learn in research methods. But in case you guys want to recall, what's up? Predictability?
Yeah.
Predictability is just how well like the research can predict the behavior. How well the theory can predict the behavior. Yeah.
What does triangulation mean? I've never heard that one.
Triangulation usually applies in qualitative studies. Triangulation means taking like several sources for your like results, to establish your results, because usually in qualitative studies it's hard to quantify things, right? It's a lot bigger of a gray area. So in order to make sure that what you're observing is consistent, there's usually triangulation. And for triangulation, you can do triangulation on researchers, which is to increase the number of researchers you have in your study to observe a certain phenomenon, let's just say something, or to review the transcript of an interview. There's also triangulation on theory, basically to use several theories to explain a certain behavior that's being observed, to make sure you're not making something up. And then, other than that, there's also triangulation on research. I think triangulation on data, so how you collect the research. Instead of only doing interview, you can also do observation, or you can also do experiments, combine a few experimental procedures and qualitative procedures to make sure that your observation is like something that's not very biased. Because that's usually for qualitative study, because they're very prone to that.
I think that's the triangulation.
Thanks. I forgot the names already.
No worries. That will work.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
What's reductionism?
Reductionism is just like how it's about whether the study, whether the study is simplifying how the behavior is. Usually this is observed in biological approach studies, like in experiments where you do cause and effect of a behavior. So behaviors are usually very complicated and complex, because there's the brain, there's the mind, there's also the environment, and all three of those, like some kind of combination of three of those, causes behavior. And reductionism is basically to approach this behavior in only one perspective and not considering the other perspectives. Yeah, and wholesome. Okay.
Oh, sorry. For human relationships, especially, or even cognitive and social cultural too, reductionist is, let's say, there's the theory of evolution in forming human relationships. You want the most attractive person to breed and make babies with, yeah? But that's reductionist because I'm sorry to interrupt. But that's reductionist. Don't form relationships just purely based on how good at looking you are to breed and make babies, That's reductionistic right there. Sure, reproduce. It's like 11 p.m. here, please don't.
Okay, so holism is like basically the opposite of it. Usually that's for social cultural approach. They have a tendency, doesn't mean all of them are, you just have a tendency to perceive things holistically. Like how in social cognitive theory, you have like so much aspects to consider about learning behavior. Like there are different frameworks in social cognitive theory that contributes to observational learning. However, most of the time, holistic stuff like that doesn't have cause and effect. So they're kind of like in the edge of the two spectrums, and usually for psychology research, you have to try to make sure to like balance them. That's the best option. That's why we can always roast like either sides. Okay, so now we have some of the common issues that we can consider in SAQ, in writing SAQs and ERQs. The first is to forget to link back. Or sometimes we also struggle in linking back in general. Wait, was that even answered before? I feel like someone asked a question about linking back in the chat, Discord chat. Oh, was that answered? Okay. Okay, I guess I'm gonna have to explain it. So, linking back, how you link back is basically you mention, at least in my perspective, it's basically you mention the evaluation, because usually like the place where we forgot linking back is the evaluation part and the conclusion part. You take the evaluation, you explain how the evaluation supports or does not support your answer in the ERQ. Does that make sense? Yeah, I'm gonna have an example after this, so I hope that clarifies it better, or if not, there's going to be a session about like ERQ writing as a whole, which Dasha is going to be hosting. Dasha is here, right? Yeah. She's going to write an ERQ for you guys.
Yeah.
Okay.
Expect more quality.
Okay, so so for the conclusion part, just make sure you're answering the question. Like literally look back at the question before answering, like writing the conclusion, and then figure out how you're going to answer the ERQ using what you have right now. I think that's the best way for you to like link back in the conclusion, which is to answer the ERQ straight up using what you have. I don't know if I can give a better tip than this. We probably need examples if you still don't understand what I'm saying. Next is a common issue that we can all make when we don't pay attention, which is to use the wrong research or to mix up content. There's a lot of terms in psychology that gets mixed up really easily, like the list that I gave: enculturation and acculturation, pheromones and hormones and neurotransmitters, using genetic similarity studies instead of kinship studies, putting fMRI or MRI, the techniques to study brain and behavior, to research methods, and a lot more. So for these, just make sure, just like, I mean, just make sure you know what's going on and study. If you study properly, I don't think you're gonna mess this up. If you don't study, just make sure you're not mixing them up. If you can. I don't know what other tip to give you for this. For next, we have artificial explanations. Most of the time, this would involve mentioning the critical thinking only, or mentioning the critical thinking, mentioning the evaluation, like the strength and limitation, giving like 1 or 2 sentence explanation, and then going on to the next limitation evaluation, the next evaluation, or going to the next study. So the issue with these is that they explain only like half of the story. So they explain how they mention a limitation. Let's just say they mention internal validity, and they also explain how like internal validity is called. Wait, did I talk about strength or limit? Okay, so let's just say that that is the strength of the study. To not confuse things up. Okay, that is the strength of the study. High internal validity, because the experiment was controlled. That's an explanation, but that's a weak explanation. And then next, whoever is writing this moves on to another explanation. Well, you have to explain how, like, the study being well controlled contributes to having high internal validity, and how that is good for the topic that's being discussed. You can't just mention it and then like, okay, so you're going to have to figure out how this is linked to the topic. Like, you can't leave things hanging and let the examiner figure things out on their own to connect the dots. You have to be the one connecting the dots. Or if not, think of it as like explaining a certain thing to a kid. Like, you literally need to explain every single step so that they can understand what you're talking about. This kind of needs practice and understanding, like being able to identify like what is artificial and what is not. A last issue that is just an issue, not really like something that's not allowed, is describing studies in great detail. So oftentimes, when people like begin writing ERQs, or just when they're rushing on their ERQs, they don't realize that they're just churning out the stuff that they're memorizing. So instead of using the stuff that they're memorizing to create an argument to talk about the topic, they're just putting the stuff that they memorize and like in great detail, and then not really doing the linking back, not really doing the explanation well. So it's you're allowed to put in details in ERQs. However, just make sure that those details are not wasting your time, for one, and two, make sure they're relevant to your arguments. So, it can be more concise and your response can be more focused and you save more time. Okay. So, this is an example of an evaluation from like the IBO exemplars. They talked about a study from Lundstrom and Olson 2005 about an experiment where females are given pheromones with a presence of a male or female researcher, and their mood is measured to see if there's mating attraction. So, like for the argued pheromone, they consider increase of mood as a sign that it's like another gender. So to signal that this is the opposite gender and an attraction could occur. And their evaluation is that although the study was well controlled due to the standard procedure dose and the standardized interview procedure, it can be criticized for the operationalization of mood, as different participants perceive and express their own mood differently. So, to evaluate the evaluation that's going on right here, the evaluation has, you can identify 2 evaluations right here, which is well-controlled experiment, high internal validity, and the lack of operationalization. However, it was not well explained, because if you see, what does it say about pheromones and behavior? Like, if you see the real excerpt, they really just describe the study, Lunter and Olson, and then talk about the evaluation here, and then they jump into another study. You don't see how that is related to pheromones. That's why it's important for you to explain and link back to the ERQ, to answer the ERQ. Okay. So if they can do better, if they talk about how that standardized procedure affects what we know about like pheromones itself. Well, if we think about internal validity, high internal validity is good because that means that we can design an experiment that's well controlled, and we can replicate that experiment and see if that experiment is easily see if that phenomenon is observed or not. That can help us understand pheromones by doing like several experiments regarding similar experiments. And well, you can go more in depth about this part, like, and talk about how in some cases the experiments did not get replicated and blah blah blah, causing the inconclusiveness in the effects of pheromones on human behavior. So yeah, you need to stretch out your explanation a bit more to pheromones on human behavior. That's how you explain better, and that's also how you link back. And next, they talk about operationalization of mood. So in this case, you can explain about why the operationalization matters. You know, like if different participants perceive and express their own mood differently, then so what? Like, why does it matter so much? They matter because that means that if people perceive mood differently, then the results that they find will be biased, since since mood is not also necessarily a good measurement for mating attraction or sexual attraction. It's kind of like, it will be a bit of a stretch to explain how mood can affect mating attraction when it's affected by pheromones. So there's a bit of an operationalization issue there. And you know, if you want to add more like evaluations for it, you can add our perspective about what we know about pheromones, like I said before. Okay. And I'm pretty sure this will be explained further like in other sessions. So do you guys have any questions before we move on? Because it's kind of almost over. Okay. No questions? All right, I'll just move on. Oh.
So I just wanted to clarify, going back to the question is pretty much just your insight on the topic, right? From what you've already discussed.
Yeah, and then like use it to answer the question. Use that insight to answer the question. Yeah. Okay. Now we have a bonus section, which is study tips. My best study tip is to not cram. Don't cram. So ideally, if you don't cram, you can do a lot of active recalls with the theories and the studies to make sure you remember the theories and the studies well, and you don't mix them up. This can be done with Quizlet, Anki, with Quizlet being like, the one that we can use in the website. However, Anki also is a great flashcard app because it allows you to customize your cards very easily. However, it can be a bit intimidating because it's kind of like using a blank page and needing to use that blank page to create flashcards. And next, other ways to study is to plan response outlines or to map responses. So as you can see, since the content that we're going to study is the same, you can plan out what you want to study, topics that you need to study, and then create an outline of what you can talk about. That can help you strengthen, using both active recall and doing the plans can help you strengthen your memory of the theories or the studies, and doing the response outlines can definitely help you to put the bits and pieces of what you remember in your brain together and help you prepare yourself better when you're writing an ERQ. Because if you memorize most of the stuff that you remember, then if you see a question, you can be confident that everything that you memorize is already in your brain, and you just need to maybe double check what you're going to write about by planning an outline for 5 minutes, and speed run, try to regurgitate whatever thoughts you have in your brain. And for it's very helpful for something like SAQs, because for SAQs, the outline is pretty clear. So if you plan a lot for those kind of SAQs, you're definitely going to you don't even need to plan for SAQs sometimes. You can just write it out without planning. But for ERQs, it's kind of complicated, right? Since sometimes the command terms can be a bit whack. So it would be very helpful for ERQs. And it is also helpful to take time to semi-plan the evaluations, but not literally memorize them. Because taking time to plan the possible strengths and limitations of a study and how it links back to the behavior helps you practice your critical thinking, for one. And two, sometimes you get stuck with doing what you're planning. Obviously, you're going to go into Google and search up possible evaluations other people might take, or trying to look back at your notes about research methods to make sure to think about other possible evaluations you can take. Or maybe if you're like me, I would sometimes go into the original study and try to check out what's up with the details of the study and what the author think of the limitations of their study. And that can help you learn more stuff and maybe stumble through interesting arguments or criticisms from other psychologists that you can take to help develop your evaluations. Well, the part, I have to take note that the part where you go in and read journals is not necessary at all. That's not necessary for you to have good evaluations. However, I just like to do that because I like psychology. And well, at least for me it helps, but you don't have to do that to get a good grade. That's what I'm saying. However, we all cram once. Okay. Sure. Mhm.
questions and you choose one of them. So do you recommend that we specialize in it, or like plan all the evaluations, or you just like recommend that we try to like learn?
To save your time, I would recommend you to try to study like one or two approaches in depth. Or if you're HL, you can do like all the HL extensions instead of doing like the approaches. It's just generally better to do one or two approaches in depth instead of like all three of them, because that's gonna waste your time. For one, because you have to memorize a lot of things, unless if you have a thing for doing that. But yeah, it's just a matter of time saving. You don't want to waste too much time memorizing stuff. Then what's the other? You're welcome. And okay, to clarify, like for the semi-planned evaluations, this is just a recommendation. You don't have to do that, because I know some people, some alumni, like there was this other helper who said that she never practiced and planned evaluations, and it worked out well for her. Well, personally for me, I just like tend to take a while to think about the evaluations if I don't plan them. So if I like semi-plan them, it would be more effective because I already know like what I need to talk about, and I don't need to think twice about it. But I think this is a also semi depends on what you think is more comfortable with what you're doing. Because as far as I know, wait, is entropy here? Oh, entropy is gone. So there was a person here before entropy. What she did was she would write evaluations, like she would plan evaluations ahead because she forgets them. And because like I guess for her, if she write evaluations, it helps her practice for her critical thinking. For one, for two, she keeps on forgetting about the evaluation she needs to give. So like writing for her it helps. But for some people, they can bullshit well enough, so they don't have to. So yeah.
Arts subjects like this, arts not as in creative arts, how well you write, and in English too, how well you write depends on how good you are at bullshitting. This applies to creative too. So just find the disconnections and then just make up reasons for it with the critical thinking points that you can make.
Wait, is there another question in the chat while we're at it? Okay, question. Do you just look at the learning outcomes and come with potential questions to make plans? So before there was this part where I showed the potential question formulations, right? And also take note, I made a mistake in the SAQ. I'm gonna fix it later. So those like kind of formatting will give you a possible mapping of the questions, like a rough possible mapping with the content combinations that's gonna come out, and that can help you like prepare for the responses. But that doesn't mean that like I think with the thing with making outline responses is that they're not going to be perfect for every response because you need to adapt to the command terms. Especially with like putting out your thesis statement or putting out your conclusion, it's important for you to answer the question directly. So the outline will help you with like the general structuring of what you want to talk about in regard to content, but it's not going to help you with answering the question. And there's, wait, yeah, yeah? Okay, no problem. Oh, and responding to don't do psychology's what don't do psychology said for potential questions, like not being able to cover all of the questions. I agree to some extent. Like some you can cover you can cover it like if you have enough time you can cover it content wise, but you won't necessarily be able to cover it like for every single command term, because you're going to have to also like to what extent does roller occur? Okay, so there's too much nuances with the command terms for you to be able to make a perfect response for every single one of them. That's why. Oh, I think it's like possible for paper 1. It's not possible for paper 2. Because paper 2 is kind of whack. I don't paper 2 is in a whack in a way where the IB syllabus tells you that the different approaches is going to be asked alongside with the topic. However, not every single topic in the options can be linked to the approaches. So it's kind of weird in a way that there are some questions that might come out, and so like according to IB wise, all the possible questions will come out, but not all the possible combinations would actually make sense, common sense wise. That's why I think it's like whack. But for paper 1, it would. It's possible to combine, like to get all the combinations. Okay, there's a question. If an ERQ comes out about discussing one cognitive bias, is a valid counter-argument bringing the role memory plays against that cognitive bias? Bringing the role memory? Sorry, can you Beyond Boy, can you please clarify your question? Because I don't fully understand what you mean by bringing the role memory plays against that cognitive bias as a counter-argument. The reliability that memory has in influencing cognitive biases. So the reliability of memory in cognitive.
Okay, then
That's
you probably use what Woodford says, flash bookmark memory or reconstructive memory, and how it, well, maybe not how it influences biases. It's more of how you recall memories and how these memories, well, in the reconstructive theory, how it's reconstructed or how it's altered due to it being a flashback. So I don't think it's a valid argument to bring memory into bias. You might want to address other types of biases, like having confirmation bias with anchoring, or with some other biases as well. In human relationships, there's a bias called I can't remember, it's too late, but it's just a type of bias when you end a relationship and you only focus on the bad things and you don't necessarily remember all the good things. So, yeah. Oh yeah, that's a good point. Memory being biased through scheme theory. Yeah, that's a good point.
Depends on what bias we're talking about, technically. But if the bias is related to memory, then it works. Okay. Okay, so as you can see in the screen, if you really need to cram, then do anything in your power to try to memorize it, like rewriting your notes, or I don't know, making flashcards, or making jokes about the theories and the studies in psychology and roasting them in your own inside jokes. Anything that helps you cram and remember. Or I personally wouldn't recommend this, but you can also take the study guides, like the notes people make in the helper website, to help you respond to exam. There was this one moment in the past when I really had to cram for paper 2, and I didn't really prepare any studies or theories for it, so I sort of used other people's notes, and it kind of worked. It's not perfect, but it worked well. I would say it would work, and maybe if you know how to structure ERQ correctly, you might get around 5 or 6. But I wouldn't. If you're cramming, yeah, just do it, man. You don't really have a lot of choices. But if yeah.
Make sure they're relevant to you, because if it's just someone else's notes, chances are you'll remember them because but of course if time is allowed. So, well, it depends on how much time you get. How much work that you get for psychology. You have to sacrifice that. That's about it.
Yeah. Okay. Good luck.
Thank you, guys.
Yeah. Okay. The thing with cramming is that if you forget stuff, then be it. Maybe you can briefly talk about what your fake memory remembers. But if you still want to try to get a good grade despite cramming, try to make sure to do the evaluation part and critical thinking well. And don't forget the link back. Those are the parts that gets you a lot of points too. And usually cost a lot of points for the people who just data's memorized instead of preparing for the responses. Okay, so this is just a short special section for Anki cards, because I've been using Anki cards to memorize, and like the thing with Anki cards is that it's like a blank sheet of paper in order to make flashcards. It's not like Quizlet where you just put back and forth and it just works. Because with Anki cards, you can make a lot of customizations with stuff like clothes, where you can like put certain places with put certain words in like blah blah 3 little dots and try to figure out what they are. So like and you can also control how often you want to recall stuff. So here are some examples of how people approach the Anki cards if you want to try. I personally, because I'm also kind of lazy, so I want to do things effectively as possible. I did something similar to Soft's Anki formatting like this. Like I guess it would be more ideal to do it like this way. Basically, like break all the detailed chunks into like small pieces, and then also have cards to link them back together. That's what this person did. They had cards for like aim procedure results, and then they have cards for how to answer X question. But because I'm lazy, I just did it like this, and I don't know. For me personally, it worked effectively. Yeah. If you have like more questions about Anki, you can like contact me next time or just ask in the Psych channel next time. It will help you. So we're almost in the end of this session. So basically what we covered today is about how paper 2 is very important and that the command terms only matter when you're responding to the question asked. And in order to score good, you have to make sure to know what the IB wants from SAQ and ERQs, and to not forget to explain and link back for the SAQ and ERQs. And also to not cram, unless if you really want to. Unless if you really can't and you really need to cram. Okay, then I won't stop you. That's okay. I understand. Okay, so for what a big brain strat.
Like you could do like SAQ every day and then one ERQ every week until the exam, like you would do fine.
But the question is, does anyone have like the dedication to do that every day? Because personally, even I myself don't have that kind of dedication. But props to you if you're doing that. That's amazing. Like, just really amazing. Okay, so before we end the session, here are some helpful resources for you that I compiled. This is basically just all the stuff from this IBO server, but I swear, trust me, it's helpful. Even I myself use them. Like, a lot of the times when I'm helping people or when I forget some stuff and I need to double check some stuff, some like theory or content. Yeah. Thank you so much for everyone for joining the session today. I feel so honored to be able to host this session with like, I don't know how many people this is, but this is a lot of people. And thank you so much for the psych people, like Don't Do Psychology, Jet, thank you. Oh, Dice is not here anymore. Thank you so much. Alright, good night.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.